Okay, good evening. This is Chapter 9 of Unit 3, which is the age of accelerating connections. So it's 500 to 1500, that millennium, and this unit encompasses 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 of the Strayer text. So I want to remind you that some things that we'll see in Chapter 8 and 9 we'll see again down the road. Strayer mentions in 8 and 9 in some ways, in some parts, the Mongols. He mentions disease spreading along trade routes, and most specifically the Black Death. He will mention the Islamic world quite often, although we haven't really discussed that starting yet. That's chapter 11. And in the look at the Chinese here, there will be made mention of their explorations, yet we haven't really discussed them doing that yet. That's chapter 13. There is some overlap here, but think about what the two chapters are trying to get you to consider. In 8, it is all about commerce, trade, the connections, that age of connections. In chapter 9, it's mostly focused on China and the rest of the world, whether that's their neighbors, their nearby neighbors in East Asia, and we'll look at them in the next set of notes. In part 1 here, we're going to really look at just these East Asian connections, and mostly this deals with China, and comparing China with, and looking at them internally some. So that's where we're going to start. Okay, so this is, of course, the Great Wall that's right in front of us here on the screen, and you're familiar with the Great Wall. Understand it's not something you can see from space. It's only about as wide as a road, or a 2-lane road. It's as tall as a building, maybe a 2-story building. Although the Great Wall is an impressive structure, it's really a series of walls. The first walls were built by Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Rome, and you'll see continuous efforts to fortify the northern region of China at this wall. During this chapter, you'll find out why. The tribute system kind of points out that the neighbors to the north, who will later become the Mongols, the group that we're going to be more familiar with, these neighbors to the north are of a different sort, a different makeup and different breed than their Chinese neighbors to the south. The folks to the north value things a little differently, and the Chinese look at them as barbarians or outsiders. But oftentimes, and this is the thing that's really confusing for some students, they fear them as much as the Chinese fear them as much as they fear the Chinese. So definitely something to keep in mind when you're checking this out, what the Great Wall is there and why it's there and why it was built. The Han Dynasty is where we're going to start. But if you notice the dates here, okay, it's from 500 to 1500 is the Unit 3 dates. Yet this chapter begins in the year 300. And why is that? Well, it's right about in the year 300 or so that we start to notice that the Han Dynasty is about to decline, and it's in this time period that Liu Bong becomes the peasant man of peasant origin who becomes emperor, and he rises to power here. So I think I might have said that the Han Dynasty begins to fall, but that's not what I meant to say. This is the beginning of the Han Dynasty. He became known as, this man, Han Gaozu, which means the exalted emperor of the Han. So he is the person that kind of founds this Han Empire. And they're very similar in some respects, and you can compare them a little bit to the Roman Empire, both during the classical time period, and so we're in the 200 to 200 range here. We're not in this millennium that Unit 3 is discussing. 500 to 500 is our last unit, Unit 2. So now we're talking the beginning of this new dynasty in China, and it's going to kind of kickstart and push the ball down the road here that other dynasties are going to pick up. But we want to compare these new dynasties in this new millennium back to the Han because they are so influential. So let's start with the Han. The Confucian principles are favored rather than legalism. If you remember legalism under the first emperor, Emperor Qin, Shi Huangdi, they were pushing legalism. They were burning books or things written by Confucius, or not by Confucius, but by his followers, and severely punishing, burying alive people who felt like Confucius was someone that they should be following and considering. Now, with all that oppression of Confucianism, you would think it would disappear, but it did not do that. It's hard to kill ideas. You can kill people, but it's hard to kill ideas. The Han continued the same type of government system developed by the Qin. And if you remember back to what that was all about, civil service exams again, the Han dynasty collapsed around 220. This empire, long divided, must unite. Long united, must divide. Thus it has ever been. This is the words of a person who wrote The Romance of Three Kingdoms. This summarizes the rise and fall of empires in China. Basically, this time period leads to 300 years of political fragmentation. We see these 300-year periods of chaos or strife or war, the Warring States period before this. So you have a period of time after the Han Dynasty where there's a struggle for power. What's interesting to note and think about is 300 years here, okay? 300 years is longer than the United States of America has been in existence. So when we discuss and try to compare things back to America, understand why I seem to think it's a little early to make judgments about whether the United States of America has been a success, whether it will work, whether it will be around much longer than it has been so far. If you look at world history, and I'm not saying I don't want America to succeed. I do. I want America to be a great country. But when you're thinking of it as a historian would, and looking at the history of the world, it's pretty obvious to note that, hey, civilizations and empires haven't lasted very long. Or ours hasn't, at least American civilization hasn't. But I will grant you that 200 years of very modern day time is packed full of events, technology, and a good way to think of this, is just the fact that what happens in a year's time now is probably similar to what happened in 50 to 100 to 300 years time back in this time period, because there's just so many more people and there's so much more connection today. It's accelerated. So, get back off my little bandwagon there about American history. But nomadic incursions from the north, we're going to start seeing more of these as we go through this time period in this chapter. Conditions will discredit Confucianism some, and in many eyes, during this 300-year period of political fragmentation, they're thinking, wow, Confucianism isn't helping. The Han turned to Confucianist ways. What good did that do? And the fourth thing is the Chinese migration southward to the Yangtze River. So it's hard to see here on the screen, but I'll move the mouse to it. There's the Yellow River in the north, and then below that is the Yangtze River. Kind of hard to remember. It sounds like Yankee to me, but it's in the more southern part. You might think to yourself, oh, that's the river down here. No, we're talking about this one here. The Chinese civilizations kind of started here, and then now they're able to connect down here. Another way to look at it here, if you look, these are very, very rugged mountains in this part. This is the plains area where people could actually live and survive. They're going to build a canal here to connect these two together, and that will have great consequences for the economy of China. So how did China and their neighbors to the north the nomads view each other. As I kind of alluded to earlier, the tribute system differed in practice from the typical ideal Chinese understanding of the operation of it. So how did the tribute system work? It was basically a system set up by the Chinese to welcome visitors, but also kind of be worshipped. They sometimes call this a kowtow, or you're bowing down to China and giving them a gift and saying, "You're great, China. You're the Middle Kingdom," which we've discussed some already. The Middle Kingdom is like, if heaven is here and this is earth, between heaven and earth is the Middle Kingdom. Or another way of thinking of it is, they're in the middle of everything. China is the best. Everything else is in the periphery of China. So they're the Middle Kingdom. The tribute system disguises some realities that contradicted its assumptions. Frequently, China was confronting not separate and small-scale barbarian societies, but large and powerful nomadic territories, able to deal with China on at least equal terms from them. So you have to be very careful to not assume that the barbarians or nomads to the north were less than the Chinese. Because in some cases they were as much or more than the Chinese were. And especially in this way, the Chinese needed the people to the north to protect them. And I'm not sure if it's on this slide, but we'll mention it if it isn't. The Xiongnu is the early nomadic confederacy to the north. And later we're going to hear of the Mongols to the north. They're going to be much more involved, and they'll be the nomads of the hour in chapter 12 at least. These raids by the Xiongnu into northern China persuade the Chinese emperor to start negotiations to arrange that recognize the nomadic state as a political equal. So they're going to have some political discussions with these nomads and have a little bit of a tribute system occur. Typically, this is all one-sided towards China. They're the receivers of gifts. But China promised the Xiongnu leader a princess in marriage, annual supply of large quantities of grain and wine and silk, and basically amounting to protection money or paying them off like a bribe. And in some ways you could think of the Xiongnu to the north as sort of a gang. You know, they're coming in and saying, hey, listen, if you don't contribute to our fund here, you don't pay us, we're going to make your lives a little bit miserable. We have horses, we have technology, and we know people who can fire some arrows, if you know what I'm saying. And we have some horses with fat behinds, so something else to think about. Well, that's a more muscular horse than some of the ones they traded to the Chinese. So if you look at the horse that you see up there at the top, there's 3 of them. You've got a white one, a black one, and a brown spotted one. And these are not the kind of horses that you would consider to be very valuable. A little plump around the middle, not a very strong back on either of them or on any of the 3. And maybe they're older horses that they can give up and give to the Chinese. Chinese don't have very many horses, so I'm sure they want them and they welcome them. But they're not giving up much. And what are they getting in return? I mean, incredible amounts of silk, grain and wine that they would need because they don't produce that potentially. And in return for all these goods, it was so critical for the functioning of the nomadic state, they needed these things. The Xiongnu agreed to refrain from political military incursions into China. They weren't going to invade. The wall to the north was protecting some population centers. But these are nomads. They could easily ride around the wall and go to the westernmost point of the wall and then ride down through. It's very possible for the Xiongnu and other nomads to the north to get to China. That's what I'm trying to say. So in what ways did the Tang and Song dynasties resemble the classical Han dynasty period? And in what ways had China changed? So we're going to look at this in 2 parts. We'll see blue for the classical Han dynasty period and how that resembled this new Tang and Song dynasties. And the ways that they changed we'll see sort of in a brownish maroon color there, so look for those. Tang and Song dynasty in China resembled the Han dynasty period in a number of ways, including Maintenance of the empirical political system. They maintained the same system that the Han had. The importance of a professionally trained bureaucracy, which meaning these are people in the government who are trained and subjected to taking the civil service exams, those competitive exams. You can see examples of those exams right there. The gentleman who is kneeling on the floor is taking exams. A very Confucius way of doing things. It focused on the Tang and the Song dynasties. Establishing a dominant political position in East Asia that was recognized by China's neighbors, so that tribute system was important to these dynasties. It had an interest in supporting long-distance trade. And why would it want to do that? Well, there's a lot of money to be made. And the continued importance of the Confucian tradition in an elite society. All of those things held true. The Tang and Song dynasties resembled the classical Han period in those ways. Now, continuing here, in what ways had China changed? There was tighter unification of northern and southern China, and they had started in the Tang and Song dynasty really ramping up this vast waterway system that started under the Sui. The long-term migration of Chinese populations to the south from the north to the Yangtze River Valley after around 220. So where you see the green dot here and where the waterway runs in green here, these are basically series of locks, and you would let water in and fill the water level so the boat would rise up to a new level. These series of locks and canals made it possible to create a waterway that connected two of the big waterways in China, giving them sort of like a north to south corridor. Although it looks like it runs east to west, it really does connect the east-west rivers of the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. So this is important. It's going to revitalize the economy of China. And it creates an economic revolution of sort, where people have jobs, there's more money flowing through the system. There's also a whole lot more food to feed people who need it now, because there's a bigger population. There was rapid population growth from 50 million to 60 million people during the Tang Dynasty. This spurs and was spurred on by remarkable growth in agricultural production. As we've mentioned here, the canals are going to help to not only help them produce food and move food and get products to people. The food that was grown in the south could now be transported to the north, and you could support a higher population. The economy of China became the world's most productive, and it's the most highly commercialized in the world. More active long-distance trade than during the Han Dynasty. So the economy of China became the most highly commercialized in the world and became more active in long-distance trade than during the Han Dynasty. So the Han Dynasty kind of kicks things off and gets things started, and shows that China is a power to be reckoned with, and they're a trading force. The Song and Tang dynasties pushed this to a whole nother level, and some of it is because of the technology we'll show you here. So you can see the connection there of the Tang dynasty. It went all the way up into the northern regions of India, above India. Why is this? Well, you've got the Jin Empire in the north and the southern Song Empire. The Jin are the ones that kind of create this new empire that continues after the Song. Remember that these are sort of like states, but they're really groups of people who are living in sort of communities, but they also have sometimes militaries when the government breaks down and there is a revolution of sorts and the dynastic cycle kind of swings into play. You'll see a twisting and turning of this, where maybe the Song had been powerful. Now those followers of the Jin are going to then end up becoming leaders in the Tang dynasty. Hard to explain, but let's look at the map of the Tang and Song dynasty in China. This is during the post-classical millennium. China interacted with its neighbors very extensively, and the Tang Dynasty extended Chinese control deep into Central Asia, while the Song Dynasty witnessed incursions by the nomadic Jurchen people, who created the Jin Empire, which ruled parts of northern China. Now this is important because these empires are sometimes favoring northern locales and sometimes favoring southern locales. Some are more Confucius, usually the southern ones are, or the more traditional. The northern empires that are kind of formed, and in some ways not as Chinese as the southern parts. And look at that, there's Korea that's part of China at this time, or at least the Jin Empire. So why is this important? Just kind of twists and changes in the wind here. The different levels of Confucianism, oppression on women, how much this society is going to allow people to have certain kinds of freedoms, those sorts of things. So notice that the Great Canal that links both the Yellow and Yangtze rivers is right there. It's that blue line. And this is very important. It's an economic boost. Now, I'm not going to play it for you, but there's a video clip here embedded about engineering an empire. It's fantastic in the part that shows you how they built and constructed this incredible waterway. Now, they used a series of locks to change the water level so that ships can ride down through it. But the amount of effort and work put in by almost a slave labor of people who worked really, really hard and were kind of taken advantage of. And during the Sui dynasty, you see those folks rebel because they realize they put in all this work and didn't get compensated for it. So the Grand Canal began under Emperor Wen of the Sui dynasty, and it completed under his son, Emperor Yang of Sui. So, did I say Sui dynasty? I meant Sui. S-U-I, Sui, Sui, Sui. Let's go to the pronunciation grid. You like pronunciations? I like pronunciations. Let's go over here and hit the pronunciation. Let's do Sui. I think it's Sui. Just to be sure, every once in a while I like to check these things. I'm pretty positive that I got it right, but well, let's find out. How to pronounce Sui. And of course it's going to depend on the website. Let's see what they say on here. Let's give me some volume.
Sui.
Oh, it's Sui. Is it really Sui?
Sui.
Let's find another one. Let's double check it. How to pronounce names. Sui. Is it Sui or Sui? Gosh. I mispronounce things sometimes, but the effort is important. It is pronounced Sui, not Sui. How about that? At least this one says that. Interesting stuff. Okay, we'll say Sui. Or, I'm sorry, Sui. Not Sui. Sui. I can do Sui. Sui. We'll get there in a second. So, completed under a son, Emperor Yang, and it's Yangdi, which is pretty kind of awesome if you think about it. Yangdi. Yangdi is a bit of like what I call the first rapper in world history in some ways. Yangdi, the emperor, and they show that in the building engineering an empire. Sorry, I'm a little tired tonight. They show him kind of floating down this new canal with all this food and women and kind of his posse, and he's rolling down the waterway, eating all this food, throwing down, getting some sun. This is pretty sweet. And all along the waterway are the people that built this thing. And they're not so pleased to be watching their emperor ride in grand style down the waterway, and what do they have? They're starving still. So there is a bit of a backlash to the emperor, Yangdi, and his ride will no longer be pimped for very long. So why are the centuries of the Tang and Song dynasty in China sometimes referred to as the Golden Age? The Sui dynasty, got it right, reunified China. And these are the guys who made the canal system that we just mentioned there. Their ruthlessness, and failure to conquer China or Korea alienated people and exhausted states' resources. So they went after Korea pretty hard. Their dynasty was overthrown, but the state didn't disintegrate. And remember what I said about the emperors who forced people to build the canal and how they weren't really compensated very well and weren't very happy. That was part of the story as well. So the Tang and Song dynasties of China were built on the Sui foundation, established patterns of China and Chinese life that last well into the 20th century. And that's one of the reasons why China is such a continuous, long empire. And they regard this time period as a golden age of art and literature, the Tang and Song dynasties. So why are the centuries of the Tang and Song dynasties why are these referred to as a golden age? Well, you see a little bit of that there. The trade that you can see happening on the left on horseback there. The writing system and printing press that's developed. There is a great there are great strides made in art and learning and also writing during this time period. A golden age is typically a time period where we look back at it and say, hey, that things went pretty well then. And we can see art and other work kind of skyrocket and take off. Whereas a gilded age would be a time period where we look back at it and say, wow, it wasn't quite as good as they may have thought it was. The Chinese printers here at work putting together kind of a wooden block printing system. You also see Buddhism, which also spreads during this time period because the Tang and Song dynasties are sometimes referred to as a golden age, and there is some movement of Buddhism as well. But it wasn't such a great time period for women because you see a return to Confucian ways. So elite women in the north had much greater freedom. As we mentioned, typically in the north and south there are some differences. The influence of the steppe nomads or the Xiongnu, and after them, later on down the road will be the Mongols. They're a little bit more open towards women and being a little less patriarchal against them. Not much, but a little less. The Song dynasty tightened up its patriarchal grip and restrictions on women. Textile production became a larger scale, and it displaced women from their traditional role in the industry. Women found other roles in cities. Prosperity of the elite created demand for things like concubines and entertainers, courtesans, and of course prostitutes. And at the very bottom here, you see a painting, which we'll look at in visual sources in the next slide of notes, or next group of notes. In this visual source, it's called an elite night party, and women are being depicted as entertainers and temptresses. As you can see, this woman right here, kind of showing her package back here to the guy in red, or just kind of showing off to him, and a little bit of flirting and stuff happening. And the story behind this is that this is painted by someone who wants to portray the heads of these government groups as being somewhat corrupt and not taking care of their duties because they're off at night at this elite party and not taking care of their business. And they're not being morally or ethically sound. That's, anyway, the reason that many people believe that this was painted. Foot binding. Oh, you gotta love it. Now, first of all, breaking your feet and squishing them in shoes like this is never a good idea. Yet women do it today. High heels are all the rage. Still, they have been for a long time. And you see good old Lady Gaga there with her huge platform shoes. The literature highlighted the subjection of women and the subjugation of women, where they were kind of under the control of men. This is a strong patriarchal time period. Foot binding starts in the 10th or 11th century, and my feet are burning right now just thinking about this, but it's totally gross, isn't it? Why did they do this? There are a lot of ideas around why, but the idea was that it was associated with images of beauty and eroticism, that they felt like women looked better this way. Now, if you say to yourself, that's crazy, what the heck? Well, in a way, don't women do that today by stuffing their feet into these high heels? And they can be very, very painful. So be careful about throwing stones at glass houses, because it'll break the glass houses. I'm not sure. It's a bit of an old saying. You can look that one up. But they kept women restricted to the house. Obviously, you're not going to run around with feet looking like that. That's absolutely gross. I can't look at that anymore. There you go. This is a little better to look at. Here's a painting that kind of depicts a little bit of what things looked like during the Song Dynasty. There were some positive trends as well. Although the Song Dynasty returned to Confucian ways, you've got women's property rights that are being expanded, so women are able to own more property. Lower ranking but ambitious officials, who were kind of upper and coming players here, were urging that women should get an education. Isn't that nice of them to get an education for women? That's so fantastic. I wonder why they did. Oh, yeah. To more effectively raise their sons and increase the family fortune. So it's always something, isn't it? I mean, it's never like, women should get an education because that'll better them. It's for their sons. What a mess. Real quick diversion here into martial arts training. For those of you who are interested in this, I've had plenty of students who are. The martial arts refers to the arts of combat and self-defense. And the self-defense part is very important to consider because Zen Buddhism is going to be a part of this chapter, and Buddhism itself. But martial arts is a significant part of Asian history and culture, and it's remained so today. It's highly visible already during the Han Dynasty, and in 495, a Zen Buddhist monastery began developing methods of physical training known today as Kung Fu. In the Tang Dynasty, descriptions of sword dances were immortalized in poems by Li Bai. In the Song Dynasty, Jiaqpu contests were sponsored by Zhangpu? No, thank you. Were sponsored by the imperial courts. So this is like a government-sponsored thing as well. Modern concepts of the wushu, the kung fu, were fully developed by the Ming Dynasty. And even today, you've got kids that sometimes participate, like little Aiden Duez here, getting his participation medal for his first year in karate. And today, we continue this. Even some cats are sometimes karate. How did they do that? I think that cat really knows Kung Fu. Well, that's the quick first look here at Chapter 9. We covered a lot of territory, comparing the Han and Tang and Song dynasties, looking at that golden period of the Tang and Song dynasty, the role of women, Confucianism, and trade in making China a superpower during this first semester. So the next time we'll look at a combination of things in Chapter 9, but mostly it's going to be China and friends. So we'll look at the different countries that they had impacts on. And country is kind of a tough term for it, but different areas or cultures that the Chinese had a lot of impact on. We'll start that for you here in a few minutes, and until next time, don't forget to be awesome.